Hello, and welcome to Question in a Bottle. In this series of short discussions, private investor Mark Atkinson answers questions sent in by listeners and subscribers to his main podcast, The Desert Island Investor. So, let's take a look and see what's in the bottle that washed up on the beach today.
Well, Paul, this is a question in a bottle with a difference, as it's written on pink newsprint, a bit of a giveaway, and it's come from the venerable Financial Times. It reads, Dear Mark, I hope this email finds you well. My name is Eri Sugiura, a reporter for Financial Times covering the leisure industries in London. I saw you previously did a podcast on investing in Entain, whose CEO, Gavin Isaacs, stepped down abruptly last month. Today I had a call with the interim CEO, Stella David, who told me that they have been very transparent and very open with investors who want to hear the truth regarding the CEO departure. May I ask you if I could have a call with you today to discuss how you see Entain? What did Entain tell you about this resignation? Are you confident enough in Entain as a company? Thank you very much for your consideration. Best, Eri. Firstly, on that Entain podcast, it was one that we released over a year ago, and the profile is that there's on the podcast there's an original spike that generally plateaus after a while. But we've been pleasantly surprised, that they've nevertheless continued to garner extra views. And indeed, looking at some of the very first that we did nearly 2.5 years ago, they're still growing. And you've half jokingly called them timeless classics, Paul. So I'll go along with that. Eric called me and we had a nice conversation. And I'm not sure if I gave her the steer she was looking for. I asked if she was looking for a smoking gun or an exclusive on the departure of Gavin Isaacs or a wider Entain piece. Now, the news of Mr. Isaacs' departure was a surprise, but it's hardly burdened my thoughts for any period of time. People move on and businesses continue. And those who follow this podcast may think that I hardly care about the portfolio at times, as I often seem ambivalent and greet bad news with something of a shrug. Once you realise that things are bad, then it's often too late to act. And again, if you have a broad enough portfolio, having a dud, I'm not saying Entain is a dud, but having a dud or several is not mission critical. There again, there are some private investors that fret about any red stocks that are underwater. And every year I expect to have some and I accept them, but hope that my winners will counteract these. Now, I think the overriding point I tried to make to Eri was that I'm far more concerned with board appointments, departures, the CV, performance and competence at a micro rather than at a large cap level. A CEO at a microcap often has more scope to create or destroy value than at the larger end. And I'm shortly scheduled to be off to the Titan Holdings annual general meeting, and it has a turnover of around £15 million. And it's Tom Carpenter's first AGM as CEO. And I'd have greater interest in analysing his words than that of a FTSE 100 boss. Of course, damage, sometimes terminal, can be done at mega businesses, but it's less common. They have the critical mass that keeps them rolling and a wider board to shoulder the responsibilities. When looking at a business, I look whether there is a tailwind or a headwind, and I prefer a tailwind with a poor CEO than a headwind with a top CEO. There's only so much that can be done by any person to counter market forces. And I'm more concerned about whether an industry is in long-term decline than who is running the show. I used perhaps a not very tactful example to Eri of gambling versus the physical newspaper industry. I think history has told us that gambling will be an ever-present. We were once gambling on things like chariot races and gladiator fights. Now, how many people under 50 buy a paper, a physical paper from a newsagent, including the FT? When the news breaks of a departure, we're intrigued as to what has happened. It's the not knowing, and humans like gossip and a good story. And it's often best to subscribe to Occam's razor. The principle, and that's the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best when there's multiple possible answers. Entain have described the parting as by mutual consent, and what benefit is to be gained through washing any dirty linen, should there be any, in public? Sometimes people start a position in all good faith, and then they find out that they cannot work with certain people. There's bad chemistry. Upon further inspection, the job is not what they anticipated. The task is too big. The scope is insufficient. The desire for the big job is just not there. We could go on and on. Mr. Isaacs left after 5 months. He's 60. He was described as being in semi-retirement and worked mainly in the US and reported as having had to relocate from Las Vegas. So perhaps he's found that he no longer has the steel in his belly, and perhaps he does not need it with a capital N. I've been retired for 6 years, and if somebody in their infinite wisdom offered me a role as, say, a non-exec, it would be flattering, but could I be bothered with the responsibility, having to report to people, having to be at certain places at certain times? In all honesty, I doubt it. Harry then asked if I saw Entain as a risk-free investment, and that's very much no. I see all my investments as having inherent risks. Some are known and others unknown. I was asked about the threat of fines on the business for previous misdemeanors, and this is a big threat to a business like Entain, and they are a sin industry, and they face punitive taxes and fines, which is another kind of tax, as they are an easy target. Now, in 2023, Entain received a penalty of £585 million under a deferred prosecution agreement with the UK's Crown Prosecution Service. And this related back to alleged bribery offences at the gambling firm's former Turkish unit. Now, this related back to 2017 when Entain was known as GVC and under previous management, and the Turkish business was sold again back in 2017. So of that 585 million, I'm not sure how much was sent to Turkey, where the offence surely occurred, or whether HMRC, whether they pocket the lot. Now, it's nice work if you can get it, and I'm sure they cannot wait for the next overseas bribery scandal. So, however severe taxes and fines and the penalties are in a business like Entain, it's a bit like a parasite. Although it's feeding off its host, it's not in its best interest to kill it. It's a bit like that quote from the galley scene on Ben-Hur, we keep you alive to serve this ship, row well and live. So in conclusion, I don't bank on takeovers, and I've said I rarely want them. But I do think in this case, it's acting as a defensive fallback position with the joint venture with MGM, and the fact that MGM have previously launched a successful bid for Entain. And I would suspect that any significant weakness in the share price would give MGM that chance to strike and take things across the Atlantic, and with it the prospect of the UK losing a lot of that tax and that fine money.
Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.